The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Danielle Carter's driveway, painting the asphalt in hues of fading gold. A weariness settled deep in her bones, the kind that clung like damp Georgia air after a long shift at the Barrow County Sheriff's Department. As she pulled her Crown Victoria into the driveway, the familiar comfort of home, a modest two-story with a porch swing and overgrown jasmine, usually eased the tension. But today, a figure stood stiffly by her mailbox, a rigid sentinel against the backdrop of her longed-for peace. Danielle recognized Margaret Whitlow, the HOA board member known for her overzealous enforcement of community rules, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. A prickle of unease tightened Danielle's chest. Just what I need, she thought, the exhaustion morphing into a low simmer of irritation. Another HOA drama. Margaret Whitlow's posture radiated disapproval. Arms crossed tight against her floral print blouse, her lips pursed in a thin line, she watched Danielle's car with an air of proprietorial scrutiny. Danielle exhaled slowly, reminding herself to remain calm. This wasn't worth ruining her evening. Ava would be home soon, expecting dinner and her usual dose of after-school chatter. The car crunched to a stop on the gravel. Danielle switched off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the chirping of crickets in the overgrown flower beds. She opened the car door, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. "You can't park here." Margaret Whitlow's voice was sharp, clipped, cutting through the quiet like a rusty saw. "This is private property." Danielle paused, one foot on the driveway, the other still inside the car. A flicker of confusion, then disbelief, danced in her eyes. "I live here," she stated, her voice level, carefully controlled. The absurdity of the situation threatened to unravel the tight knot of her composure. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, a mask of unwavering certainty. She took a step closer, her eyes sweeping over Danielle's uniform with a dismissive flick. "I don't think so," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "I know who belongs here." A cold dread washed over Danielle. It wasn't about the parking. It was something else, something lurking beneath the surface of Margaret's words, something ugly and familiar. She recognized that the veiled disdain, the assumption of guilt, the subtle but unmistakable message, "You don't belong." Danielle stepped out of the car, forcing herself to stand tall, her sheriff's badge glinting in the fading sunlight. "I assure you, Mrs. Whitlow, this is my address. I own this house." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Well, I haven't seen you before," she said, her tone accusatory. "And you certainly don't fit the profile of this neighborhood." Danielle's jaw tightened. The simmering irritation flared into a hot, angry pulse. The implication hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. She swallowed the bitter taste of injustice that rose in her throat. Profile? What profile? The unspoken words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the invisible walls that still divided their community. "I'm Sheriff Carter," Danielle said, her voice hardening, "and I suggest you familiarize yourself with the residents before making such assumptions." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise momentarily disrupting her composed facade. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a stubborn set to her jaw. "I'm on the HOA board," she declared, puffing out her chest as if the title conferred some special authority. "And I have the right to question suspicious behavior." "You're trespassing." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and heavy with prejudice. Danielle's mind raced. This wasn't about a parking violation. It was a power play, a blatant display of racial bias disguised as community vigilance. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. She just wanted to go inside, to hug Ava, to forget the day's burdens. But something shifted inside her, a quiet resolve hardening in the face of injustice. She wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. "Trespassing on my own property?" Danielle asked, her voice laced with incredulity. "You're making a serious accusation, Mrs. Whitlow." Margaret's face flushed with a righteous indignation. "I'm placing you under citizen's arrest," she declared, her voice trembling with self-importance, "until we can verify your identity." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. Danielle felt a cold anger settle in her gut. This wasn't just about her. It was about every slight, every sideways glance, every whispered comment she'd endured throughout her career, throughout her life. This was about the insidious, pervasive racism that still infected the very fabric of their community. And she was tired of it. Just then, the porch light of the house next door flickered on. Walter Dunn, the retired mechanic, stepped out, his wife, Beatrice, trailing behind him. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to concern as they took in the scene. Across the street, Julian Park, the Korean-American software engineer, emerged from his garage, his brow furrowed in confusion. The small tableau of their quiet suburban street became a silent audience to the unfolding drama. "What seems to be the problem, Margaret?" Walter Dunn's voice, calm and steady, broke the tense silence. Margaret turned, her face tight with annoyance. "This woman," she gestured towards Danielle, "is trespassing. I'm placing her under citizen's arrest." Beatrice Dunn's eyebrows shot up. "Trespassing? Danielle lives here, Margaret. What on earth are you talking about?" Margaret sputtered. "That's what she claims. But I've never seen her before. She doesn't belong here." A quiet voice, laced with apprehension, came from the doorway of Danielle's house. "Mom!" Danielle turned to see Ava standing on the porch, her eyes wide with confusion. The sight of her daughter, a silent witness to this humiliating spectacle, tightened the knot of anger in Danielle's chest. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to maintain a semblance of control for Ava's sake. Julian Park, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Mrs. Whitlow, I've seen Sheriff Carter here many times. She lives here with her daughter." The weight of their collective gazes, the quiet condemnation in their eyes, finally seemed to penetrate Margaret's self-righteous bubble. Her face paled, the flush of indignation fading into a sickly white. Danielle met Margaret's gaze, her own eyes unwavering. "As I said, I'm Sheriff Carter, and I'm going inside my house. Now." She turned and walked towards her daughter, ignoring Margaret's spluttering protests. As she stepped onto the porch, Charlene, her neighbor from across the street, rushed over, her face a mixture of concern and anger. "Danielle, are you okay? I saw what happened." That woman, Danielle placed a hand on Charlene's arm, a silent plea for calm. "I'm fine," she said, her voice weary. "Just tired." But the exhaustion was more than just physical. It was the bone-deep weariness of constantly having to prove her worth, her right to belong, in a community that still saw her skin color before her humanity. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Danielle's driveway, the asphalt radiating the day's accumulated heat. A tightness coiled in her chest, a familiar knot that cinched a little tighter with every pointed word from Margaret Whitlow. Danielle had just wanted to get inside, to the cool sanctuary of her home, to the scent of Ava's latest baking experiment wafting from the kitchen. Instead, she was trapped in this absurd tableau, the target of Margaret's laser-focused disapproval. "I'm telling you, this neighborhood doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior," Margaret said, her voice thin and reedy, each word a carefully aimed dart. The behavior in question, as far as Danielle could gather, was her own existence in this predominantly white enclave. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, thicker than the humidity clinging to her skin. Danielle's jaw clenched. "Patience," she told herself. It was a mantra she repeated often in her line of work. "Ma'am, I live here. I'm just coming home from work." The weariness in her voice was genuine. The badge she carried represented authority, but it couldn't shield her from the insidious sting of prejudice. "Oh, really?" Margaret's tone dripped with skepticism, her eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Danielle from head to toe. The way she held her purse tighter, as if Danielle posed a physical threat, stoked a flicker of anger in Danielle's gut. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain a neutral expression. This wasn't worth it. Not now. Not after the day she'd had. "Yes, really. Now, if you'll excuse me," Danielle attempted to sidestep Margaret, to reach her front door, which seemed miles away. Margaret, however, planted herself firmly in Danielle's path. "I'm not convinced. You fit the description of someone who's been casing houses." The words hung in the air, ugly and accusatory. Danielle's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. Descriptions. What descriptions? The unspoken implication, the insidious racial profiling, made her blood boil. This wasn't about broken HOA rules. It was about something far more sinister. "I'm Sheriff Danielle Carter of Barrow County," she stated, her voice low and steady, the words punctuated by the thump-thump of her own heartbeat in her ears. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of her badge. Margaret scoffed. "Right? And I'm the Queen of England. You expect me to believe that?" The dismissiveness in her voice, the utter refusal to acknowledge Danielle's authority, ignited a blaze of fury within her. She pulled out her badge and ID, holding them out for Margaret to see. "Badge, photo ID, Barrow County Sheriff's Office," Danielle said, enunciating each word clearly, each syllable a hammer blow against Margaret's smug facade. A flicker of something surprise? Disbelief? Crossed Margaret's face, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of stubborn defiance. "That could be fake," she muttered, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence, a tremor of uncertainty creeping in. Danielle felt a surge of exhaustion wash over her. She had dealt with hardened criminals, faced down armed suspects, navigated complex investigations. Yet, here she was, standing in her own driveway, battling the entrenched prejudices of a woman who refused to see her for who she was. The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. From the corner of her eye, Danielle saw her daughter, Ava, watching from the doorway, her face a mask of quiet apprehension. The sight of her daughter, a silent witness to this humiliating spectacle, fueled a fresh wave of anger. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ava, about the kind of world she was growing up in. A voice, gruff and familiar, broke the tense silence. "Margaret, what in the Sam Hill is going on here?" It was Walter Dunn, her neighbor, a retired mechanic with a penchant for tinkering and a surprisingly keen sense of justice. His wife, Beatrice, stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression mirroring Danielle's own frustration. Margaret flustered, her gaze darting between Danielle and the Dunns. "I caught this woman trespassing," she stammered, her voice trailing off. "Trespassing?" Walter's voice boomed, laced with incredulity. "Danielle lives here. We've been neighbors for 5 years." Beatrice chimed in, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Margaret, you're making a fool of yourself. Leave Danielle alone." Julian Park, their Korean-American neighbor, who usually kept to himself, emerged from his house, his eyes fixed on Margaret. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I saw everything. You were harassing her." One by one, the neighbors emerged, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation, chipping away at Margaret's pretense of authority. The shame was palpable, radiating from her like heat from the asphalt. Her face, earlier flushed with righteous indignation, now paled, the blood draining away. Later, after the crowd dispersed and Margaret retreated, defeated, Charlene, a black neighbor Danielle hadn't yet met, approached her, her eyes filled with understanding. "I saw it all," she said, her voice soft and comforting. "I know what you're going through." The shared experience, the unspoken solidarity, offered a small measure of solace. But the sting of the encounter lingered, a bitter reminder of the invisible walls that still divided their community. The knot in Danielle's chest remained, a persistent ache. She unlocked her front door, stepping into the cool dimness of her home, the aroma of burnt sugar and something vaguely floral greeting her. Ava stood in the kitchen, her face etched with a mixture of concern and confusion. Danielle forced a smile, trying to project an image of strength, of resilience for her daughter. But inside, a quiet storm raged, a battle against the ingrained prejudices that threatened to suffocate her spirit. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just one skirmish in a much larger war. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Danielle's driveway, painting the asphalt with streaks of amber and violet. A tremor of exhaustion pulsed behind her eyes, a dull ache that mirrored the knot tightening in her stomach. She'd hoped for a quiet evening, a simple dinner with Ava, maybe an hour curled up with a book before bed. Instead, she found herself facing Margaret Whitlow, the HOA president's shadow, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Margaret's grip on her phone tightened, knuckles bone white against the plastic. "I'm simply trying to keep our streets safe," she repeated, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that Danielle found more unsettling than outright hostility. Danielle's jaw clenched. Safe from whom? From a tired woman in her own driveway? The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with implication. She could feel the weight of Margaret's gaze, assessing, judging. It scraped against her skin like sandpaper. A wave of frustration washed over her, hot and prickly. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. This wasn't worth it. She wouldn't give Margaret the satisfaction of a reaction. "I live here," Danielle stated, her voice level. "I'm not trespassing." Internally, she was screaming. The sheer audacity of the situation was baffling. To be accused of trespassing in her own home by a woman whose understanding of safety seemed to begin and end with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. The absurdity of it all threatened to crack the carefully constructed composure she'd cultivated over years in law enforcement. Margaret's lips thinned. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," she said, her eyes flitting towards Danielle's car, a late-model sedan, hardly a vehicle to inspire fear. "And you haven't answered any of our welcome wagon attempts." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Danielle knew exactly what Margaret meant. A black family in a predominantly white neighborhood was, in itself, suspicious. The welcome wagon had likely consisted of thinly veiled interrogations disguised as neighborly greetings. She'd avoided them intentionally, sensing the undercurrent of unease, the subtle probing that felt more like an intrusion than a welcome. A small click broke the tense silence. Margaret had taken a picture of Danielle's license plate. The flash of the phone camera felt like a physical blow, a stark reminder of the constant scrutiny she faced. Danielle's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the pressure building in her chest. This had gone far enough. Just as Danielle was about to speak, a voice boomed from across the street. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Walter Dunn, a retired mechanic whose house sat diagonally across from Danielle's, stood on his porch, his brow furrowed in confusion. His wife, Beatrice, stood beside him, her arms crossed, a look of disapproval etched on her face. The shift in Margaret's demeanor was almost instantaneous. The rigid posture softened slightly, the saccharine smile returning. "Just a little misunderstanding, Walter," she said, her voice dripping with false cordiality. "This woman seems to be having trouble finding her way." "Trouble?" Beatrice's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air. "From who?" "From a black woman in her own driveway." Her eyes, bright and piercing, fixed on Margaret. A ripple of unease spread through the small gathering of neighbors who had begun to congregate, drawn by the escalating confrontation. Phones were out, recording the scene. Danielle felt a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort. She didn't want to be a spectacle, but she also knew that the presence of witnesses was her best defense against Margaret's insidious accusations. Walter descended his porch steps, his gaze shifting from Margaret to Danielle. "Danielle, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The simple act of being addressed by her name, by someone who saw her, not as a threat, but as a neighbor, brought a surprising wave of emotion. "I'm fine, Walter," she managed, her voice a little shaky. "Just a neighborhood dispute." "Dispute?" Walter's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Margaret. "It looks to me like you're harassing Danielle." Margaret's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "I'm simply following protocol," she sputtered. "We need to know who's living in our community." "She's your neighbor, Margaret," Walter said, his voice laced with exasperation. "She's lived here for months. You've seen her daughter playing in the yard. You brought them cookies, for God's sake." Margaret's face flushed crimson. "That was before," she stammered, her voice trailing off. "Before she knew. Before she realized that the new family on the block wasn't just new, but different." From the edge of the crowd, Julian Park, a Korean-American software engineer who rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone, cleared his throat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "Leave her alone, Margaret." One by one, other voices joined the chorus of dissent. The tide had turned. The whispers, the sideways glances, the unspoken assumptions that had clung to Danielle since she moved and were suddenly brought into the harsh light of day. The pressure in Danielle's chest began to ease. She glanced towards her front door, where Ava stood, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Seeing her daughter's anxious face, Danielle straightened her shoulders. She wouldn't let this go. She wouldn't let Margaret, or anyone else, make her feel like a stranger in her own home. "Margaret," Danielle said, her voice clear and strong, "I am the sheriff of Barrow County. I think I know a thing or two about safety and suspicious activity. And right now, you're the one disrupting the peace." The silence that followed was thick with shock. Margaret's eyes widened, her jaw slack. The whispers started again, this time with a different tone, a mixture of disbelief, and was that a hint of shame? Danielle met Margaret's gaze, holding it steady. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the air. Later, after Margaret had retreated, her face a mask of humiliation, after the neighbors had dispersed, murmuring apologies and reassurances, after Ava had been tucked into bed, Danielle sat on her porch swing, a mug of chamomile, tea cooling in her hand. Charlene, a woman who lived a few houses down, had brought it over, along with a plate of freshly baked cookies. "Just wanted to check on you, Sheriff," she'd said, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. The simple gesture, the acknowledgement of her position, but also the underlying message of solidarity, had brought a lump to Danielle's throat. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, the accusations, the whispers, the sudden shift in public opinion. It was a small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be intimidated. But the exhaustion remained, a deep bone weariness that went beyond the long day at work. The fight was far from over. She knew that. But tonight, at least, she could sit on her porch under the fading light of the setting sun and breathe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Danielle's driveway, painting the asphalt with streaks of orange and purple. The air, still thick with the day's heat, vibrated with unspoken tension. Danielle could feel the weight of eyes on her, the silent judgment pressing against her skin like a humid blanket. She stood by her car door, her hand still on the handle, the metal cool against her palm, a small anchor in the swirling chaos. Margaret Whitlow, her face a mask of righteous indignation, hadn't moved an inch. Danielle's daughter, Ava, hovered in the doorway, her youthful face a canvas of confusion and burgeoning fear. The quiet hum of cicadas seemed to amplify the silence between Danielle and Margaret, a silence pregnant with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. "Just breathe, Danielle," she told herself, "just breathe. Get inside. Get Ava inside." But her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body refusing to obey the commands of her weary mind. Margaret's voice, sharp and brittle, shattered the uneasy truce. "I'm simply upholding the rules of this community, Sheriff. You should know better than anyone the importance of following regulations." The words dripped with condescension, each syllable a carefully aimed dart. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, the exhaustion of the day pressing down on her. Regulations? This isn't about regulations, Margaret. This is about the thought remained unfinished, a bitter taste on her tongue. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to give Margaret the satisfaction, but the unspoken word hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Race. Across the street, Walter Dunn, his weathered face creased with concern, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Beside him, Beatrice, her arms crossed, glared openly at Margaret. Danielle caught Beatrice's eye, a silent message of solidarity passing between them. It was a small comfort, a tiny spark of warmth in the growing chill. A new voice, quiet but firm, sliced through the tension. "That's enough, Margaret. This isn't right." Julian Park, who usually kept to himself, stood on his porch, his normally placid face etched with disapproval. He'd always seemed so reserved, sound-readable. Danielle hadn't realized he'd even been watching. A flicker of surprise, then a surge of gratitude, washed through her. Julian's words, though soft, carried a weight that surprised even him. He'd seen the fear in Ava's eyes, the subtle tightening of Danielle's jaw, the blatant prejudice masquerading as community concern. He couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. Margaret whirled around, her eyes blazing. "And what business is it of yours, Julian? This is a matter for the HOA." Her voice, though still sharp, held a tremor of uncertainty. Julian's intervention, unexpected and unwelcome, had thrown her off balance. The carefully constructed facade of neighborhood harmony began to crumble, revealing the ugly cracks beneath. Danielle took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. The exhaustion was a physical ache now, settling deep in her bones. "You blocked my car. You threatened to call the police. You tried to detain me in front of my child." Each sentence was a separate accusation, delivered with a controlled calmness that belied the turmoil within. She fought the urge to raise her voice, to unleash the fury that simmered just beneath the surface. "Stay calm, Danielle. For Ava." Margaret's face flushed crimson. "I had every right. You were behaving suspiciously, lurking around." Her voice trailed off, the lie wilting under the weight of Julian's steady gaze. He simply raised an eyebrow, the silent question hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Lurking? In my own driveway?" Danielle thought, the absurdity of the accusation almost comical. Almost. The quiet murmur of disapproval rippling through the small gathering of neighbors was a tangible thing now, a low hum of discontent. The carefully maintained illusion of neighborly camaraderie had shattered, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of the fault lines running beneath the surface of their community. The lines of race, of privilege, of unspoken prejudice, drawn stark and undeniable in the fading light. Beatrice Dunn stepped forward, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "Margaret, you should be ashamed of yourself. You've made a fool of yourself, and you've embarrassed this entire neighborhood." Her words, sharp and direct, hit their mark. Margaret flinched, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, finding none. Charlene, another black neighbor, emerged from her house, her expression a mixture of concern and solidarity. She put a hand on Danielle's arm, a silent offering of support. The small gesture sent a wave of warmth through Danielle, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Margaret, isolated and increasingly flustered, stammered, I just thought it's my duty." Her voice trailed off, the words hollow and unconvincing. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a dawning realization of the magnitude of her misjudgment. Danielle, her hand still on Ava's shoulder, felt a shift within her. The weariness remained, but it was now mingled with a steely resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ava. It was about all the other Avas who might one day face the same insidious prejudice. She straightened her shoulders, her voice regaining its strength. "My name is Danielle Carter, and I'm the sheriff of Barrow County." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of a passing car. The revelation, stark and undeniable, hung in the air like a thunderclap. The expressions on the faces around her shifted again, a kaleidoscope of shock, embarrassment, and dawning understanding. Margaret's face, already pale, drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The carefully constructed mask of authority had crumbled completely, revealing the fear and insecurity beneath. The air, thick with unspoken tension just moments before, now crackled with a different kind of energy. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with the weight of what had been said, and what remained unspoken. The long shadows deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight, leaving them standing in the twilight, facing the uncomfortable truths that had been brought to light. The taste of Margaret's defeat was still acrid in the air, clinging to the fading sunlight that painted long shadows across Danielle's driveway. Margaret, face blotchy and pride shattered, retreated with a parting shot. "This isn't over, Sheriff. You'll see." Danielle watched her go, the woman's words like pebbles tossed against the fortress of her composure. A flicker of something cold, hard as granite, settled in her gut. "Not over? It never began, Margaret. You brought this on yourself." The satisfaction, though, was thin, brittle. This victory felt like ash in her mouth. From the corner of her eye, she caught the movement of the curtains in Walter and Beatrice's living room falling back into place. Julian Park gave a small, almost apologetic nod before retreating into his house. Charlene, however, lingered, a silent pillar of support at the edge of the driveway. The quiet hum of concern in her eyes, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, that was the balm Danielle needed, the quiet recognition of the shared burden. They saw it. They all saw it. A sigh escaped Danielle's lips, a slow release of the tension that had coiled tight in her chest. She turned towards the house, the familiar weight of her badge digging into her hip, a constant reminder of the role she played, the expectation she carried. "Sheriff, even here, in my own driveway, I can't escape it." Then, the low thrum of an engine approaching broke the fragile peace. Two police cruisers, sleek and impersonal, pulled up onto the street, their flashing lights painting the twilight as stark blue and red. Danielle felt the granite in her stomach harden. No, not this. Not now. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. She hadn't even made it inside yet. Hadn't even had a chance to greet her daughter. Ava stood framed in the doorway, her silhouette dark against the warm light spilling from inside. Danielle saw the question forming in her daughter's eyes, the unspoken worry tightening her small frame. How do I explain this to her? How do I explain that even in our own home, we are not safe? The thought was a sharp, stinging blow, a visceral reminder of the invisible walls that confine them. Two young deputies emerged from the cruisers, their movements stiff and uncertain. They were fresh-faced, barely out of the academy, the uniforms still crisp and new. Danielle recognized the type. Eager to prove themselves, quick to judge. They approached her slowly, their hands hovering near their holsters. The air crackled with unspoken assumptions, the weight of history pressing down on them like a physical force. "We got a report of a suspicious individual refusing to identify themselves," the first deputy said, his voice echoing the practiced authority he was still learning to wield. His gaze flickered over Danielle, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal in his eyes. Danielle felt a surge of anger, hot and immediate. It warred with the bone-deep weariness that clung to her like a second skin. Suspicious? In my own driveway? After all that just happened? She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and forced herself to maintain her composure. She had to be careful. She knew how quickly things could escalate. "What's your name, deputy?" Danielle asked, her voice level and controlled, every word a carefully placed stone in the wall she was building around herself. "Name and badge number." The deputy hesitated, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He clearly hadn't expected to be questioned. He glanced at his partner, a silent conversation passing between them. Danielle saw the subtle shift in their demeanor, the realization dawning on them that they might have misjudged the situation. "Deputy Miller, badge number 427, he mumbled, his voice losing some of its initial bravado. His partner, a young woman with a tight, nervous smile, followed suit. "Deputy Clark, badge number 512. Danielle's eyes never left them. She could feel Ava watching from the doorway, her small form radiating anxiety. This is what she sees. This is what she learns. The thought twisted in Danielle's gut, a bitter taste rising in her throat. Deputy Miller, Deputy Clark, Danielle said, her voice calm but edged with steel. I'm Sheriff Danielle Carter of Barrow County. This is my home. She gestured towards the house. The simple act of ownership, a small rebellion against the suspicion that clung to her like a shroud. The deputies exchanged another look, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. The color drained from Deputy Miller's face as recognition slammed into him. He stammered, Sheriff Carter? We didn't. Danielle cut him off, her patience wearing thin. You received a call about a suspicious individual. You arrived at the scene. You made assumptions. Do you understand the problem here, deputies? The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken weight of prejudice and ingrained bias. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene. Danielle could feel Ava's gaze on her, a silent plea for reassurance. I have to be strong. For her. We apologize, Sheriff Carter, Deputy Clark finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The apology felt hollow, insufficient. It couldn't erase the sting of the humiliation, the weight of being judged and found wanting based on the color of her skin. Danielle nodded curtly, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. Go back to your patrol. And next time, deputies, try asking questions before jumping to conclusions. As the cruisers pulled away, their flashing lights receding into the darkness, Danielle turned to Ava, forcing a smile onto her tired face. Let's go inside, sweetheart. Dinner's waiting. The silence that settled between them as they walked into the house was different from the silence outside. This silence was thick with unspoken emotions, with the shared knowledge of a battle fought and won. But at what cost? Danielle knew that this evening, like so many others, would leave its mark on Ava, etching itself into the fabric of her young life. The fight was far from over. It had just begun. The flashing blue and red lights retreated, leaving swirling trails of color imprinted on Danielle's retinas. The sharp scent of exhaust lingered, a bitter aftertaste to the metallic tang of fear that still clung to the back of her throat. She stood on her driveway, the concrete cold beneath her thin-soled work shoes. Her hand, still gripping her purse strap, felt numb. This is my home, she thought, the words echoing hollowly in the sudden quiet. This is supposed to be my sanctuary. Deputy Hayes, his face a mask of awkward embarrassment, shifted his weight from foot to foot. Sheriff Carter, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Our sincerest apologies. We weren't aware. His partner, a younger man with wide, still shocked eyes, nodded vigorously in agreement. Danielle recognized him, Miller, fresh out of the academy. He probably hadn't even processed the irony yet. He called me ma'am just minutes ago. The thought pricked at her, a sharp reminder of the layered humiliation of the encounter. That's the problem, Danielle said, her voice flat, devoid of the authority she wielded within the walls of the Barrow County Sheriff's Department. Here, in her driveway, in front of her neighbors, her badge was invisible. Her skin was all they saw. They saw a threat, a trespasser, not the sheriff. The realization settled like a stone in her gut, cold and heavy. Ava stood silently beside her, her small hand clutching Danielle's. Her daughter's silence was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Danielle felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield her from the ugliness that had just unfolded. Ava hadn't said a word throughout the ordeal, her dark eyes wide and unblinking, taking it all in. What was she thinking? Danielle wondered, her heart aching. What seeds of doubt have been planted tonight? A warm hand touched Danielle's arm. Honey, are you all right? It was Charlene from 2 houses down. Danielle had seen her around, exchanged polite waves, but they'd never really spoken. Charlene's face, framed by braids woven with beads, radiated concern. That woman's something else. Charlene shook her head, her expression a mixture of disgust and empathy. I'm Charlene, by the way. We should have done this properly ages ago. Danielle managed a weak smile. Danielle, she replied, her voice still tight. And this is my daughter, Ava. Ava, finally breaking her silence, offered a shy nod. Charlene's presence, her genuine concern, was a small balm on the raw wound of Margaret's accusations. It was a reminder that this wasn't the whole picture, that there was kindness here, too. I saw it all from my kitchen window, Charlene continued, her voice low. That Margaret's always got something to say, always stirring the pot. You don't deserve that, honey. None of us do. But it happened, Danielle thought, the words a bitter refrain in her mind. It happened, and it will probably happen again. The thought was a chilling premonition, a cold draft in the warm evening air. As the neighbors dispersed, the quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was heavy, laden with unspoken words, with the weight of what had just transpired. Danielle felt the eyes of the community upon her, felt their judgments, their assumptions, their whispers. They know now. The realization was both a relief and a burden. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A notification. Social media. A pit formed in her stomach. She knew, without even looking, what it would be. The whispers had already begun to spread, amplified and distorted by the digital echo chamber. This is how it starts, she thought, a familiar weariness washing over her. This is how one incident, one misunderstanding, becomes a narrative, a label, a stain. Later, as Ava slept soundly in her bed, Danielle sat on the edge of the sofa, scrolling through the comments. Some were supportive, expressions of outrage and disbelief. Others were laced with veiled prejudice, thinly disguised behind questions and concerns. Is it true? I always thought something was off. Maybe she shouldn't be living here. The words were like tiny darts, piercing the fragile peace she had tried to construct. She considered filing a formal complaint, making Margaret answer for her actions. But the thought drained her. It would be a battle, a public spectacle, and in the end, what would it achieve? It wouldn't erase the prejudice, wouldn't change the underlying assumptions that had fueled Margaret's accusations. It would only prolong the pain, amplify the whispers. Closing her eyes, she took a deep breath, the image of Ava's sleeping face flickering behind her eyelids. For her, she thought, I have to find a way to move forward, to create a better world for her. The decision wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about survival, about finding a way to navigate a world that often felt hostile, a world that saw her skin before it saw her badge, her humanity. It was about choosing her battles, about knowing when to fight and when to simply breathe, to gather strength for the next inevitable confrontation. The healing, she knew, would be a long and arduous process, a slow climb towards a fragile peace. The air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from whispers and stares. The quiet hum of suburban life, once a comforting rhythm, now throbbed with an unsettling undercurrent. Danielle pulled into her driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath her tires a stark contrast to the disquiet gnawing at her insides. The incident, now days old, had metastasized, its tendrils creeping through the manicured lawns and pristine facades of Oakhaven Estates. Her phone buzzed incessantly, each notification a fresh wave of nausea. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a forum for lost pets and garage sales, had become a battleground. So, the woman I accused of trespassing turned out to be the county sheriff. Guess we all make mistakes. Margaret Whitlow's post, punctuated by a winking emoji, felt like a slap. Danielle's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her breath catching in her throat. A mistake, as if mistaking salt for sugar, as if forgetting to water the petunias. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate act of prejudice, veiled in the guise of misplaced vigilance. A mistake, she thought, the words a bitter taste in her mouth, that could have cost me everything. Beneath Margaret's post, the comments proliferated, a digital tapestry of opinions, some supportive, others chillingly reminiscent of Margaret's own warped perspective. Well, she did look suspicious. One neighbor wrote, the words hanging in the digital ether, sharp and accusatory. Danielle closed her eyes, the image of Ava's frightened face flashing behind her eyelids. Her daughter had witnessed the whole ordeal, the fear in her eyes a mirror to Danielle's own suppressed panic. I refuse to let it make me smaller, Danielle whispered to herself, The words a mantra against the rising tide of anger and humiliation. The support, while welcome, felt like a flimsy shield against the relentless barrage of judgment. Walter and Beatrice Dunn, their voices unwavering, had publicly condemned Margaret's actions, their words a beacon in the storm. Julian Park, initially hesitant, had also spoken up, his carefully chosen words resonating with a quiet strength. Even Charlene, from across the street, had dropped by with a casserole and a hug, her silent solidarity a balm on Danielle's raw nerves. But the whispers persisted, the sideways glances, the subtle snubs, each a tiny paper cut on her already wounded spirit. Each morning, the walk to her car felt like a gauntlet. She imagined their eyes on her, dissecting her movements, judging her every breath. The once familiar faces of her neighbors now seemed masked, their smiles strained, their greetings laced with an uncomfortable tension. She felt a constant hum of anxiety vibrating beneath her skin, a low-grade fever she couldn't shake. Sleep offered little respite, her dreams haunted by Margaret's condescending tone and the accusing glint in her eyes. Ava, too, had retreated into herself, her usual bubbly chatter replaced by a quiet reserve. Danielle tried to talk to her, to reassure her, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. How could she explain the insidious nature of prejudice, the way it could twist the most ordinary of interactions into something ugly and dehumanizing? How could she shield her daughter from the realization that even in their own neighborhood, even in their own home, they were not safe from the insidious gaze of suspicion? The HOA meeting, convened by a flustered Craig Holman, offered little in the way of resolution. Margaret, defiant, doubled down on her accusations, painting herself as the victim of a misunderstanding. The air in the community room crackled with unspoken tensions, the forced civility a thin veneer over the simmering resentment. Danielle listened, her jaw clenched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had considered addressing the gathering, laying bare the hurt and anger that churned within her, but the words caught in her throat. What was the point? Would her words change anything? Would they penetrate the wall of prejudice that Margaret and her ilk had erected? As the meeting droned on, a profound weariness settled over Danielle. She realized that this fight, this constant battle against the ingrained biases of her community, was draining her. It was stealing her peace, her joy, her very sense of self. A shift occurred within her, a subtle but profound change in perspective. She wouldn't let the prejudice win, but she wouldn't engage with it either. She wouldn't waste her energy trying to convince people who were unwilling to see. She would continue to be Sheriff Carter, a woman of integrity and strength, but she would no longer allow herself to be defined by their limited perceptions. She would let them reveal their true colors, and she would find solace in the knowledge that their judgment reflected their own shortcomings, not hers. Driving home that night, the weight on her chest felt lighter, replaced by a quiet resolve. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching and distorting the familiar landscape. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw Ava sitting on the porch swing, a book open in her lap but her gaze fixed on the horizon. Danielle stopped the car and turned off the engine, the silence punctuated only by the chirping of crickets. She watched her daughter, her heart aching with a fierce protective love. This fight, she realized, wasn't just for herself. It was for Ava, for her future, for the hope that one day she wouldn't have to face the same battles. And in that moment, Danielle found a new kind of strength, a quiet resilience that whispered, "I will not be broken." The air in the community clubhouse hung thick with the unspoken. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the rows of folding chairs. Danielle Carter sat stiffly, the metal digging in her back, a stark contrast to the plush leather of her office chair. She could feel the weight of eyes, some curious, some accusatory, all heavy on her. This wasn't the courtroom, not her usual battleground. This was her supposed sanctuary, her neighborhood, and yet it felt like enemy territory. The scent of stale coffee and cheap air freshener mingled, a sickly sweet perfume masking the underlying tension. Just 2 days ago, this same room had hosted a potluck, filled with forced smiles and neighborly chatter. Now it was a crucible. Margaret Whitlow sat a few rows ahead, ramrod straight, her chin held high, a picture of indignant righteousness. Danielle fought the urge to roll her eyes. The woman clung to her perceived injustice like a life raft, oblivious to the swirling currents of her own prejudice. Danielle's hand instinctively went to her badge, tucked beneath her blazer. A symbol of authority, a shield, yet it hadn't shielded her from Margaret's venomous accusations in her own driveway. It hadn't shielded Ava, her daughter, from witnessing the ugliness unfold. The memory of Ava's face, a mixture of confusion and hurt, tightened Danielle's chest. Craig Holman, the HOA president, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, stood at the makeshift podium. He cleared his throat, the amplified sound echoing in the tense silence. "As you all know," he began, his voice strained, "we're here to discuss the incident that occurred on Tuesday evening." Incident, such a sanitized word for the raw, exposed nerve of racism that had been laid bare. Danielle's jaw clenched. The meeting devolved into a chaotic murmur. Whispers veiled accusations, justifications disguised as concern for community safety. Danielle listened, her stomach churning, the familiar taste of bitter frustration rising in her throat. This wasn't about safety. It was about fear. Fear of the unfamiliar. Fear of anything that didn't fit neatly into their curated world of manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. Fear of her. Walter Dunn, his weathered face etched with lines of quiet strength, spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmuring tide. "Margaret," he said, his tone firm but respectful, "you were wrong. Plain and simple. You jumped to conclusions, and you embarrassed yourself, and frankly, you embarrassed this community." Beatrice, Walter's wife, nodded vigorously, her eyes fixed on Margaret. A small wave of support rippled through the room, a few heads nodding in agreement. Margaret bristled, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I was simply upholding the rules," she retorted, her voice tight with indignation. She was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Driving while black. Existing while black. Danielle felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was Sheriff Carter here, not just a tired, frustrated black woman trying to get home to her daughter. She rose to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. All eyes turned to her. "Sheriff Carter." Craig Holman stammered, clearly flustered. "That's right, Mr. Holman," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. "Sheriff Carter, your neighbor, the one who supposedly posed a threat to your community." She paused, letting her words sink in. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle prickle of discomfort. "Safety should never be an excuse to harass your neighbors," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, lingering for a moment on Margaret, "especially when your neighbors were the same badge as the officers you'd call in a real emergency." A wave of realization washed over some faces. Embarrassment, shame, a flicker of understanding. Others remained impassive, their expressions carefully neutral. Julian Park, their Korean-American neighbor, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "I agree with Sheriff Carter," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We need to be better than this." The dam had broken. A chorus of voices rose, some in support, some in continued defense of Margaret's actions. The room buzzed with a chaotic energy, the carefully constructed facade of civility crumbling. Danielle stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of exhaustion and a strange sense of hope. The conversation, however uncomfortable, was finally happening. The wound had been opened, and perhaps, just perhaps, it could finally begin to heal. Craig Holman, his face pale, raised his hands in a gesture of appeasement. "We understand," he said, his voice strained, "and we sorry." The words felt hollow, inadequate, but they were a start. After the meeting, Charlene, another black resident, approached Danielle. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For speaking up." Danielle nodded, a weary smile touching her lips. The fight was far from over, she knew. But tonight, a small crack had appeared in the wall of prejudice. A small but significant shift, and sometimes that was all it took to start a landslide. She thought of Ava, of the world she wanted her daughter to inherit. A world where coming home wouldn't feel like a battle, and the fight, however tiring, continued to be worth it. The fluorescent lights of the community hall buzzed, a stark contrast to the simmering silence that followed the HOA meeting. Craig Holman, the HOA president, his face a mask of strained neutrality, watched the residents file out, each carrying the weight of the evening's revelations. Margaret Whitlow, her face pale and drawn, avoided eye contact, her brisk exit a stark contrast to her usual imperious stride. Danielle sat for a moment, the hard plastic chair digging into her back, a familiar ache mirroring the tightness in her chest. The apologies, the awkward pronouncements of support, the veiled condemnations, they all swirled in the air, a dissonant chorus that offered little solace. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this wasn't over. This wasn't a single incident to be dissected and dismissed. It was a crack in the foundation, a glimpse into the fault lines that ran beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy. The drive home was quiet. Ava sat beside her, her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights, a small furrow between her brows. Danielle wanted to reach out, to bridge the silence with words, but the right ones eluded her. What could she say that wouldn't diminish the ugliness her daughter had witnessed? What could she offer as a balm against the sting of prejudice? The quiet hum of the engine filled the void, a steady rhythm against the tumultuous thoughts that crowded her mind. The days that followed were a slow, subtle shift. A quiet acknowledgement hung in the air, a shared understanding that things were different now. Julian Park, his usual reserved demeanor softened, offered a small, hesitant smile when they crossed paths at the mailbox. Beatrice Dunn, her eyes sparkling with a familiar warmth, brought over a plate of freshly baked cookies, her touch lingering on Danielle's arm a moment longer than usual. Charlene, her voice low and steady, shared stories of her own experiences, a quiet solidarity that resonated deep within Danielle's soul. These small gestures, these quiet acts of connection, were like tiny stitches mending a tear in the fabric of their community. Yet, the silence from some was deafening. Margaret Whitlow, once a ubiquitous presence, became a ghost, flitting in and out of her house, her eyes averted, her presence a constant reminder of the incident. The unspoken tension, the careful avoidance, it was a different kind of burden, a heavy cloak of unease that settled over Danielle's shoulders. One afternoon, weeks after the meeting, Danielle found Ava in the backyard, meticulously tending to a small patch of wildflowers that had sprung up near the fence. The sunlight caught the vibrant hues of the petals, a splash of color against the backdrop of the weathered wood. Danielle watched her daughter for a moment, the gentle curve of her back, the focused expression on her face. A wave of tenderness washed over her, a fierce protectiveness that ached in her chest. "They're beautiful," Danielle said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then a slow, hesitant smile. "Yeah," she murmured, her fingers gently tracing the delicate veins of a purple blossom. "I planted some seeds after the meeting." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the Whitlow's house, then back to the flowers. "I thought maybe they could use a little color." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. The simple act, the quiet defiance, the unspoken message of hope, it resonated with a power that far surpassed any grand gesture. She knelt beside her daughter, her hand resting lightly on Ava's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ava's eyes, usually bright and full of life, shimmered with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you," she replied, her voice barely audible. For everything. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared strength, a quiet resilience that bloomed in the space between them. The wildflowers, their vibrant petals reaching towards the sun, became a silent testament to the enduring power of hope, a small but meaningful act of reconciliation, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, beauty could still find a way to bloom. Danielle knew that the scars of the incident would remain, a permanent etching on their lives. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that they would face whatever came next together. They were stronger now, forged in the crucible of prejudice, their bond tempered by the shared experience. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the vibrant colors of the wildflowers, they found a strength that transcended the ugliness they had endured, a strength that would carry them through whatever storms lay ahead. The fight for justice, for equality, for understanding, it was a long and arduous journey. But in that shared moment of quiet defiance, they found the strength to keep walking, to keep fighting, to keep hoping. And that, Danielle realized, was all that truly mattered. They were a family. They were a community. And they would not be broken.